Welcome to the History in Focus channel. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss more videos like this one.
What would you do if you discovered that the worst punishments inflicted on enslaved people in the United States were legalized in written code, defended in courts, and practiced with total impunity for 2 entire centuries? Forget what school textbooks told you. The reality was built with branding irons, rope, and forced silence. Here are the 14 most brutal punishments of American slavery. Punishment number 1, the forced treadmill. Labor that served no purpose beyond deliberate suffering. Enslaved people were forced to walk continuously on a mechanical treadmill powered by the weight of their own bodies. It did not grind grain, it did not move water, it served no productive function whatsoever. It was pure punishment, designed to exhaust and humiliate at the same time. The pace was controlled from the outside, the pain from within. The pace of the treadmill was regulated externally by the torturer, not by the legs of the victim. Any stumble sent the shins and ankles crashing against the steps in constant rotation. The wounds opened. The process started again. There was no pause to heal. The treadmill restarted the next day with the same injured legs, the same weight, the same relentless rhythm that did not accept hesitation as an answer. The forced treadmill was not improvised. It was technology imported from 19th century British prisons that arrived at American plantations as a refined instrument of control. Owners who wanted to punish without leaving visible marks on the back found in the treadmill an elegant solution. The body destroyed itself from the inside, slowly, far from the eyes of anyone who was not supposed to see what was happening. In British prisons, the stepping mill required up to 8 hours of forced walking per day, the equivalent of climbing over 10,000 feet of altitude in a single day. For enslaved people on plantations, the duration was determined by the anger of the master, not by any written regulation. The difference between 1 day and 2 days on the treadmill could mean the difference between walking normally and never walking correctly again. The worst detail about the treadmill: nobody needed to strike a blow to apply this punishment. The torturer stood to the side, watching calmly. The enslaved person's own body performed the work of destruction, hour after hour, until the legs simply would not obey anymore. That was the most calculated cruelty of all. It turned the victim into their own executioner. The system could not have been more efficient. Punishment number 2, the iron contraptions. An industry built specifically to torture human beings. Blacksmiths on plantations and manufacturers in the North developed a complete catalog of devices designed to cause pain without killing, at least not immediately. The creativity invested in these devices was inversely proportional to the humanity of those who ordered and promptly paid for them. Spiked collars were among the most common devices in the American South. An iron ring with inward-facing spikes fastened around the neck, not tight enough to suffocate, but positioned to prevent any comfortable rest. The enslaved person could not lie down without the spikes piercing the skin. Weeks wearing one of these guaranteed sleepless nights and raw flesh below the jawline. There were also forced posture structures, wooden and iron frames that locked the body at painful angles for hours or consecutive days. The wrists could be fixed above the head, the knees bent and tied, the ankles secured to stakes in the ground. Doctors of the era documented permanent joint damage after prolonged periods. This was not negligence. It was the stated objective. Excessive weight shackles completed the available arsenal. Chains with iron balls weighing between 9 and 18 pounds were fastened to the ankles of enslaved people who had attempted to flee. The weight turned every step into an additional and continuous punishment. Normal work continued, picking cotton, cutting cane, with the iron dragging along the ground. The cruelty was in the detail. Life did not stop. 19th century records describe devices that progressively compressed the fingers. Gradual tightening screws used as improvised interrogation on plantations. Others cut off circulation at the wrists for hours. Surgeons hired by the plantations documented amputations that became necessary after prolonged use. The owner rarely faced consequences for the result. The enslaved person survived mutilated, when they survived at all. The market for punishment instruments operated openly and without shame. Shops in New Orleans, Charleston, and Savannah sold collars, shackles, and restraining structures like any common agricultural equipment. Illustrated catalogs arrived at plantations by mail with delivery timelines and manufacturer warranties. Torture had a listed price. It was business like any other, just with a lot more blood. Punishment number 3, the barrel of nails. And the testimony reached us because Moses Roper survived to write about what he lived through. Roper was born in 1815, the son of an enslaved woman and her own master, and spent his childhood being resold from plantation to plantation across South Carolina and Georgia. In 1838, he published in London a narrative that described with precision the instruments used against him. The device was simple in construction and absolutely calculated in the horror it caused. Nails were hammered from the outside of a large barrel with the points facing inward. The enslaved person was shoved into the barrel. The lid was closed. Then the barrel was rolled downhill while the nails pierced the skin with every full rotation. The speed controlled the intensity. The slope controlled the duration. What made this punishment particularly brutal was not just the pain, it was the audience forced to watch. Moses Roper described how the owner gathered other enslaved people to witness the ordeal. The message was explicit. Anyone could be next. The audience did not choose to be there, but carried the weight of what they had seen. The torture did not end when the barrel stopped. It continued in the nightmares of everyone. No doctor was called after the barrel. The puncture wounds were treated with salt to disinfect, they said, but the real effect was to prolong the agony for additional days. Roper described weeks of recovery after a single session. In the intervals, the work did not stop. The plantation did not wait. The body had to keep up with the pace of the harvest, injured or not, with or without actual physical capability. The narrative of Moses Roper was published with the support of British abolitionists and became a fundamental document of the anti-slavery movement in the United Kingdom. He described at least 5 methods of torture suffered on different plantations in the American South. Each account was accompanied by a note from the editors, verified and confirmed by witnesses present. The cruelty had a record. The impunity did too. What Roper's records reveal with clarity is that there was no standardized system for these devices. There was unlimited and entirely unpunished individual creativity. Each owner developed their own personal preferences. The barrel of nails was not universal. It was the particular invention of one specific man. What was common to all of them was only the absolute impunity. Anything was possible. Nothing was forbidden. Punishment number 4, forced starvation. Depriving food was a punishment as common as the whip in the American South. The daily ration of an adult enslaved person was calculated at the biological minimum, about 1 pound of cornmeal and a piece of salt meat per week. When punishing through hunger, the owner simply cut that off without warning, without a set deadline. The enslaved person worked the same amount on an empty stomach until the master decided the lesson had been learned. Hunger as punishment had a practical advantage for owners. It left no visible mark. Solomon Northup described in 12 years of slave weeks in which he received only water and raw corn after disobeying an order. The body stayed on its feet. The work kept getting done. From the outside, nothing indicated what was happening. That was exactly what made the method so appealing for those who needed to maintain the appearance of acceptable treatment. Enslaved children suffered disproportionately. On plantations in Georgia and South Carolina, records from the era show that children under 12 received half the ration of adults under normal conditions. As punishment, that ration was cut in half again. Some children stole scraps of animal food because they could not endure the hunger. When they were caught, the punishment became more severe, creating a cycle with no way out. Food deprivation was also used as a tool of collective control. If one enslaved person fled or resisted, the entire quarters could have their rations cut for days. The logic was deliberate, to turn the companions themselves into monitors of each other's behavior. Frederick Douglass described the psychological weight of knowing that any act of personal resistance would result in hunger for everyone around him. Individual punishment became group pressure. The period between Christmas and New Year was the only rest guaranteed by custom. Owners distributed extra food on those days as a gesture of control, not generosity. When an enslaved person committed a serious offense during that period, losing the Christmas food was punishment calculated to humiliate in the deepest possible way. Northup described grown men crying not from physical pain, but from watching their children go without food on the only days when they had promised it would be different. The physical effects were documented by the plantation doctors themselves, hired by the owners. Records from Mississippi in the 1840s describe enslaved people with clear signs of chronic malnutrition, inflamed gums, impaired vision, swollen extremities. The doctors recommended nutritional replenishment not out of compassion, but out of economic calculation. An enslaved person too weakened did not produce. The line between punishment and permanent incapacitation was managed like a spreadsheet. Punishment number 5, the smokehouse, documented by the formerly enslaved William W. Brown in his 1847 narrative. Brown escaped slavery in Missouri in 1834 and became one of the most important American abolitionists. What he described about the smokehouse was not rumor nor rhetorical exaggeration to move readers. It was direct memory, with names and dates verifiable in plantation records. The operation was precise and deliberate. The enslaved person was tied inside a smokehouse, originally used to cure meats, and first whipped with the back laid open. Then the owner or overseer lit a fire of tobacco stalks on the floor. The dense, toxic smoke filled the enclosed space with no way out. The enslaved person inhaled concentrated smoke over open wounds, immobilized. Tobacco stalks produce specific and intense smoke, thick, rich in nicotine and irritating compounds, different from ordinary wood smoke. Inhaled by a body in shock from the whipping, it caused convulsions, vomiting, and loss of consciousness. Brown described cases in which the victim had to be pulled out before dying, not out of mercy, but because a dead enslaved person represented an immediate financial loss. The smokehouse had a characteristic that made it especially useful as an instrument of punishment. It was part of the normal and visible infrastructure of any plantation. No owner needed to justify its existence to anyone. No visitor would find it strange to see one. It was just an agricultural building until the door closed and the fire was lit. The torture hid behind ordinary routine. William W. Brown documented this and other practices with a precision that deeply disturbed readers in the American North. His book, published in Boston in 1847, sold more than 10,000 copies in the first years. An extraordinary number for the time. The North read it, voted for politicians who defended slavery, and continued doing business with the South. The information was available. The choice to ignore it was too. Punishment number 6, sexual abuse. The American slave system gave the owner total control over the body of the enslaved person. Total. That included what no school textbook named directly. Harriet Jacobs wrote in 1861 that Dr. Norcom began whispering obscenities in her ear when she was 13 years old. It was not an exception. It was the normal functioning of a system that treated people as property, with no legal boundary between what an owner could or could not do. The law did not protect. In no slave-holding American state did legislation exist that criminalized what an owner did to his enslaved people. None. What happened inside a plantation was legally invisible. Jacobs described years of trying to avoid Norcom without being able to turn to anyone. Not the police, not a judge, not a priest. Any formal complaint from an enslaved woman against her master was, in practice, impossible to be heard. For enslaved women, the threat was constant and calculated. Owners used vulnerability as a tool of control, not just over the victim, but over the entire family. Jacobs documented how Norcom threatened to sell her children whenever she resisted. The child became a hostage. The mother became a prisoner not by chains, but by love. It was an architecture of control more sophisticated and crueler than any iron instrument. The children born from these situations created a moral problem that the American South resolved in brutal fashion. The law dictated that the child followed the condition of the mother, not the father. This meant that an owner could be the biological father of his own enslaved people without any legal consequence. Frederick Douglass suspected that his own father was his master. He wrote about it without certainty because the answer was never given to him. That silence was also part of the system. The women who resisted were punished with the whip, with sale, with separation from their children. Those who did not resist carried the weight of what had happened without being able to speak. Harriet Jacobs spent 7 years hiding in a space barely over 3 feet high in her grandmother's attic to escape Norcom. Unable to move, without natural light, hearing the voices of her children below without being able to touch them. 7 years. She considered that better than the alternative. It is estimated that hundreds of thousands of enslaved women were subjected to this system over the 2 centuries of American slavery. The real number will never be known because there was no record, no possible complaint, and no official word for what was happening. The narrative of Jacobs was published in 1861 and ignored for decades. Only in the 20th century did historians begin to treat her testimony as the historical document it always was. Punishment number 7, prolonged chaining. And the most extreme case documented in the United States did not come from a plantation in the rural interior, but from an elegant mansion in the heart of New Orleans. In April 1834, a fire on the 3rd floor revealed what Marie Delphine LaLaurie, a member of the city's Creole elite, preferred that no person ever find. The fire was not part of her plans. When the firefighters climbed to the 3rd floor of 1140 Royal Street, they found what the newspapers of the time described as scenes of horrible barbarity. Enslaved people were chained to the walls, some suspended by the neck with chains that prevented any resting position. Limbs stretched for days had developed permanent contractures. Some could barely move when they were rescued. Madame LaLaurie hosted New Orleans society at elegant parties, while the basement and 3rd floor functioned as active torture chambers. Politicians and doctors dined in the parlor, while enslaved people agonized above them. No neighbor had reported anything before the fire. The fire revealed what collective silence had been hiding. And that silence belonged to an entire elite that chose not to ask questions. Prolonged chaining causes specific and well-documented damage according to modern medicine. Chains on the wrists or ankles for periods exceeding 48 hours cause pressure injuries and severe circulatory disruption. Within weeks, the damage becomes permanent. Tissue necrosis, bone infection, definitive loss of limbs. The victims found in the LaLaurie mansion presented exactly these severe conditions. After the fire, a mob destroyed the mansion entirely. LaLaurie fled to France before she could be captured. No criminal case was successfully concluded in the courts. Louisiana law of 1834 prohibited cruel and inhumane treatment of enslaved people. But no effective sanction was applied to the most serious and public case in the state. The episode caused national outrage. The result was 0 convictions. Ordinary chaining, quite different from the extreme case of LaLaurie, was routine practice on plantations throughout the American South. Enslaved people considered runaways were chained to workstations during the day and to the floor of the quarters at night. The additional weight of the iron turned every task into doubled effort. The stated objective was security. The real effect was exhaustion and systematic degradation. Punishment number 8, the bell collar, a device that turned the enslaved person's own movement into permanent and continuous betrayal. The structure was a metal ring fixed around the neck with a wooden or iron frame rising above the shoulders and a bell attached at the top. Every step, every turn of the head, every deeper breath made the bell ring. Silence became biologically impossible. The device was applied specifically to enslaved people considered prone to flight. Anyone who had attempted to escape at least once. The message was direct: you can try to run, but you will announce every step along the way. The forest that once offered cover became an enemy. The silence of the night, an enemy. The bell turned any escape attempt into automatic and inevitable auditory suicide. It was impossible to silence the bell without external help from another person. It was impossible to remove it without specific tools and a second person assisting. The enslaved person carried the device during work, meals, and sleep. If sleep was even possible, with iron on the neck and metal ringing with every shift in position. The sleep deprivation caused by the collar was in effect accepted and even approved by owners. The bell collar appears in abolitionist engravings and in narratives of formerly enslaved people with sufficient frequency to confirm its widespread use throughout the South. It was not the invention of one specific region. It was technology shared and refined among owners from different states. Blacksmiths in different regions produced variations of the same device. Some models included 2 or 3 bells. The cruelest detail of the collar was not the weight, nor the constant physical discomfort. It was the permanent public humiliation. On any visit to town, at any market, in any encounter with other enslaved people, the bell announced to everyone, this man, this woman tried to flee and failed. The device was not just punishment, it was a public narrative told to anyone who had ears to hear. Punishment number 9, amputation. And the word must be said directly without euphemism of any kind. In cases of open resistance, physical confrontation, or repeated escape attempts, owners ordered the removal of body parts as formal and deliberate punishment. It was not the result of violence in the heat of the moment. It was a premeditated decision, sometimes with a doctor present, sometimes without. It was administrative. The cutting of ears was among the most documented practices in the historical records of the American South. In courts of the 18th and 19th centuries, it appears as codified punishment for enslaved people who demonstrated repeated rebellious behavior. The ear was cut with a knife or scissors, the wound cauterized with a hot iron to prevent death from hemorrhage. The owner rarely faced any consequences for the act. It was within his rights. The amputation of hands or feet was a penalty prescribed for escape attempts in certain jurisdictions of the American colonial period. Virginia laws of the 17th and early 18th centuries provided for this punishment explicitly in legal text that any lawyer could consult. The enslaved person who survived was left physically incapable of any future escape. The reasoning was economic and direct. A worker with 1 foot was worth more than a dead one. The castration of enslaved men was documented as punishment for relations with white women, consensual or not, real or merely presumed by neighbors or by the owner himself. In several recorded cases, the accusation was sufficient for the sentence without any formal trial of any kind. Sexual mutilation as an instrument of social control appears directly referenced in legal documents of the period. Without access to adequate medical care, many victims died of infection in the weeks following the procedure. Open wounds in work environments, damp fields, barns with animals, quarters without ventilation, were ideal terrain for gangrene to advance rapidly. The owner who ordered the mutilation knew this risk. Sometimes that was exactly the desired result, a death with no record of murder. The extraction of eyes is the rarest of the documented cases, but it appears in at least 2 court records from South Carolina and in 1 narrative of a formerly enslaved person from Louisiana. In all cases, the prior accusation involved alleged assault on the owner or the family. The formal courts refused the cases. The mutilation was applied informally, before any formal trial. The order always came from the owner. Punishment number 10, hanging without immediate death. And that distinction changes absolutely everything. Unlike formal execution, this method was not intended to kill quickly. The enslaved person was suspended with a rope around the neck, but without the drop necessary to break the cervical vertebrae. Death by slow asphyxiation could take from minutes to hours. In documented cases, the objective was for the victim to survive the process. The mechanics of asphyxiation by suspension without a drop are specific and well understood. Pressure on the trachea and carotid arteries causes gradual loss of consciousness within minutes, but not necessarily death, depending on the body weight and the positioning of the rope. Owners who understood this distinction could calibrate the suspension time to keep the victim conscious and in agony without reaching the point of death. Temporary hanging as punishment was documented primarily as a method of deliberate collective intimidation. It was carried out in a visible location within the quarters, with other enslaved people forced to watch the entire process. The message was not, "This will kill you." The message was, "I can do this whenever I want, for as long as I want, and there's absolutely nothing you can do about it." Narratives of formerly enslaved people from the 19th century describe variations of the method: suspension by the wrists with the feet barely touching the ground. Technically not a hanging, but with enough pressure to cause permanent shoulder damage after hours. In other accounts, the suspension by the neck was interrupted before death and resumed after the enslaved person regained consciousness. The cycle repeated for as long as the torturer decided. Survivors of partial asphyxiation present brain damage from oxygen deprivation, airway trauma, cervical injuries, and documented permanent neurological effects. The victim who survived the punishment rarely came out whole and returned to work the next day with a marked neck, eyes red from hemorrhagic petechiae, and the memory of every suspended second that no amount of sleep could erase. Punishment number 11, demotion and forced sales. And that distinction matters far more than it appears at first glance. For enslaved people who worked as cooks, tailors, or house servants, demotion to field work was not a simple change of duties. It was the destruction of a position built over years, a minimally more protected existence, eliminated at the whim of a master. Fieldwork in the American South in the 19th century had precisely documented conditions: 12 to 16 hours daily during harvest, exposure to the sun without protection, food insufficient for the level of effort required, and a high mortality rate on record. Enslaved people who arrived at the fields after years of domestic service rarely survived a complete season. Their bodies were not conditioned for it. Sale to owners of known reputation was the maximum degree of the specific punishment. The slave market in the South was not anonymous. Information circulated about how each planter treated his labor. Being sold to certain sugar plantations in Louisiana or rice plantations in South Carolina was a sentence known to all. Life expectancy in the swampy rice fields was less than 7 years. Family separation as punishment was widely documented and deliberately used as a permanent and effective threat. The owner who sold the mother away from her children, or the husband away from his wife, achieved two simultaneous results: the punishment of the enslaved person and terror in the rest. Frederick Douglass described witnessing the separation of families as the most traumatic memory of his entire childhood in slavery. The slave market of New Orleans, the largest in the Americas in the 19th century, processed between 10 and 12,000 transactions per year at the peak of the human trade. Punitive sale was a routine transaction. The owner indicated to the broker that the enslaved person was difficult or rebellious, and the price dropped automatically. The informed buyer acquired cheap labor for high-risk operations. The system profited from the punishment. Punishment number 12, doubled labor. You picked too little today, tomorrow you pick double. That is how it worked. There was no possible argument. In the American South, the cotton quota was calculated at the limit of the human body. When an enslaved person did not reach the number, the punishment was not just the whipping that night. It was the next day's quota increased. If the new target was not met, the whipping came again, a mathematical trap designed to have no way out. Frederick Douglass described this in detail in his autobiography. After 10 hours in the field, the enslaved person who committed any offense was sent back to work at night, shelling corn, sawing wood, hauling bundles by lantern light until the early hours, without supper, without rest. The goal was not just to punish, it was to break any remnant of resistance before dawn, when the cycle restarted exactly where it had stopped. Solomon Northup documented in 12 years a slave something the owners knew very well. Doubled labor left no visible mark on the body. Unlike the whip, there was no scar to show a judge or a passing abolitionist. An enslaved person could be destroyed from the inside, bone by bone, over the course of weeks, without any evidence appearing. It was the perfect punishment for those who needed to keep up appearances. Sunday was the only day of rest guaranteed by law in the American South. Taking away Sunday was a routine punishment, applied for any minor offense. An enslaved person could lose the only day they were permitted to grow their own food, visit family on neighboring plantations, or simply rest. Owners would cancel Sundays for weeks in a row. Northup reported months of working 7 days a week without interruption. The cruelty of the system was in the mathematics. An exhausted enslaved person produces less. Producing less, they receive punishment and a higher quota. With a higher quota and a destroyed body, they produce even less. With each cycle, the margin for error shrank and the punishment increased. Owners in Mississippi documented this method in plantation records as a way to extract the maximum before the body gave out for good. It was management, not anger. That was the most frightening part. Punishment number 13, the whip, the most omnipresent and most documented instrument of all American slavery. It was not reserved for extreme cases of declared resistance. It was an everyday management tool, applied for arriving late to the field, for working too slowly, for working too fast, for looking in a way considered insolent, for not smiling when the overseer expected to see a smile. The standard instrument was the cowhide, a whip made of ox leather about 5 feet long, thicker at the base and tapering to a thin tip. The impact of a single blow on a bared back caused immediate and deep laceration. At high speed, the sound could be heard hundreds of yards away. In the narratives of formerly enslaved people from the 1930s, that sound appears repeatedly as the background noise of their own childhood. The case of Gordon, photographed in 1863 after escaping to the Union lines in Baton Rouge, became the most powerful visual document of the American abolitionist movement. His photograph, a back covered by a dense grid of overlapping scars, forming the texture of old tree bark, was reproduced in newspapers throughout the North. The editors published it with reluctance. The impact was immediate and absolutely permanent. Gordon stated he had been whipped regularly over the course of many consecutive years. His back did not show scars from isolated incidents. It showed stratification, tissue upon tissue, cut upon healed cut, reopened and healed again. Union Army doctors who examined him estimated the marks had between 5 and 10 years of constant accumulation. Gordon's body was the physical archive of an entire life. The whipping of pregnant women was documented with absolutely disturbing specificity in historical records. To avoid damage to the fetus, a valuable economic investment for the owner, some ordered a hole dug in the ground where the belly could be accommodated while the back was whipped. The detail reveals the logic of the entire system in a single image. The suffering of the mother managed to protect the property. Frederick Douglass, in his 1845 autobiography, described the first whipping scene he witnessed at the age of 7. Aunt Hester, hanging by her wrists from the ceiling, being whipped by the owner while she screamed for mercy. Douglass wrote that the scene remained engraved forever as the blood-stained gate to the hell of slavery. She had gone out without permission. That was enough for everything that came after. Punishment number 14, branding with a hot iron, and the only punishment on this list that was explicitly legalized in written and numbered code. The Code Noir of Louisiana, based on French colonial laws, established in Article 38 that enslaved people who attempted to flee for the third time could be branded with the letter M, for marron, meaning fugitive, directly on the face. The law had an article. The article had a number. The branding iron was heated until red hot, a temperature of approximately 650 degrees Fahrenheit, and pressed against the skin for 2 to 5 direct seconds. The depth of the damage depended on the temperature and the duration of contact, but any application to the face resulted in a permanent scar immediately visible to any person. The letter, the owner's initial, or the plantation symbol was imprinted on the body forever. The function of branding was multiple and calculated with technical precision. It identified the enslaved person as the property of a specific master, useful for recovery in case of another escape. It publicly signaled that this person had attempted to flee, a warning for other owners and professional slave catchers. And it humiliated permanently and visibly, making it impossible for any attempt to blend in with the free population. Branding on the face was distinct from branding on the shoulders, arm, or chest used for simple property registration. The face was a deliberate and calculated choice, impossible to hide, immediately visible in any social interaction, impossible to disguise with clothing of any kind. Branding the face was branding the public identity of a human being permanently and irrevocably. It was the maximum degree of dehumanization. American owners outside the jurisdiction of the Code Noir used branding on their own initiative, without formal legal basis, as punishment for individually perceived offenses. Narratives of formerly enslaved people describe brandings with the owner's initials, inventory numbers, and specific plantation symbols. The branding system was so widespread across the Americas that researchers estimated tens of thousands survived bearing these marks. And then the cycle closed completely. The enslaved person branded on the face tried to flee again, because what was left to lose? They were captured more easily, identifiable by any person who saw their face anywhere. They were returned to the plantation. They were whipped, chained, sold. The system did not require perfection to function. It only needed to be sufficiently brutal so that the majority would never try. And it worked for 2 centuries.